Good evening, and thank you for coming to the launch of my biography of James Edward Smith, the Lord Treasurer of Botany. Today, Smith is generally known, if at all, for two things. His purchase of the scientific collections of Carl Linnaeus in 1784, and his founding of the Linnean Society of London in 1788. Yet in his own lifetime, for over 40 years, Smith stood at the helm of British botany. A prolific author, publishing not only the first illustrated flora of Australia, but also the first illustrated work on North American insects, amongst a host of other useful, beautiful, and important works. He was also a dynamic patron of learning, developing and granting access to his world-famous collection of unique specimens, and fated as Linnaeus' scientific heir across the Western world. And I hope through this talk and in my biography of Smith, I will be able to give a fuller picture of this engaging son of the Enlightenment. So it all begins on the 10th of January, 1778, when an 18-year-old James Edward Smith could be found deep in the ditches of Norwich Castle. The previous day, he'd bought his first botanical book, John Berkenhout's Outlines of the Natural History of Great Britain and Ireland, arranged according to the principles of Carl Linnaeus. He was so excited on receiving this that he went looking for plants the very next day, even though it was still the middle of winter. He soon spied a sprig of common gorse, Ilex europaeus, and as he examined this solitary specimen, he had something of an epiphany, as Berkenhout's explanation of Linnaeus' system of classification came to life. He carefully collected and preserved the specimen, and it was one of the first plants to enter a herbarium, a collection of dried plants that would grow to contain over 27,000 specimens. By curious coincidence, on the very same day, Linnaeus died in Uppsala in Sweden, and in a neat piece of mythology building, after he died, Smith's widow, Pleasance, wrote of this coincidence: "In an age of astrologic faith, such a coincidence would have excited superstitious reflections, and the polar star of the great northern philosopher might have been supposed to shed its dying influence on his young disciple." So Carl Linnaeus, for those that don't know, was born in 1707 in Sweden, and is today known as the father of modern taxonomy, the science of classifying living things. During the course of the 18th century, he revolutionized the study of natural history, with an exacting and systematic mind. He questioned the contemporary methods for plant classification then in use, which were in danger of being overwhelmed by the flood of new species being discovered in the New World. In 1735, he published Systema Naturae, in which he introduced his own scheme for classifying plants, known as the sexual system, as it was based on the reproductive organs of the plants, the flowers. The vegetable kingdom was divided into 24 classes, based on the number and arrangement of the stamens, the male organ, with each class then being subdivided into orders based on the number and arrangement of the pistils, the female organ. This extremely simple and convenient system was accessible to, not only to learned men, but to women and children. And in 1753, in species Plantarum, Linnaeus introduced binomial nomenclature, in which a unique two-part name, the genus and species, is used to name all living creatures. Linnaeus was not a modest man. One of his own personal mottos was "God created, Linnaeus organized." But there was more than a little truth in this, as by the time he died in 1778, he had named over 7,700 plants and 4,400 animals. He was also the first to describe whales as mammals, as well as creating the entire class of mammals, and also the first to place humans with other primates. And with some adaptations, the system he devised for classifying animals is still in use today, though that for plants has since been replaced. So now back to Smith. He was born in Norwich on the 2nd of December, 1759, the eldest of 8 children of a prosperous textile merchant. And the family lived at number 37 Gentleman's Walk, which faced onto the market square, and was also the family shop. The picture here shows him aged around 4 years old. He was an indulged favorite, educated entirely at home, a sensitive boy, frequently ill, with a love of flowers that he inherited from his mother. And one of his earliest memories was, I quote, "tugging ineffectually with all my infant strength at the tough stalks of the wild succory on the chalky hillocks about Norwich." He was destined for the silk trade, but resisted, determined for botany to form part of his life. At that time, there were no professional posts for botanists. The only options for someone interested in botany to pursue that interest professionally would be to take up physic, as the knowledge of plants was essential for dispensing medicine, or to go into the church, as the study of nature was a natural extension of the worship of God. Smith was a Presbyterian, so the church was not an option for him. So instead he went to the University of Edinburgh from 1781 to 1783 to study medicine. Despite the distance, he was still his father's favourite. And this is a letter that his father wrote to him in his first term in Edinburgh, where you can just see here, pray remember not to press your stomach against the table, but write with your body as upright as you can. Smith was about 23 years old at this point. He quickly made a name for himself, exhibiting two key personality traits: fastidious attention to botanical detail, for which he was awarded Professor John Hope's Medal for the Best Scottish Herbarium, and keen social skills, forming a student natural history society. In the autumn of 1783, Smith moved to London to continue his medical studies at the Great Wimwell Street Anatomy School and at St. Bart's Hospital. He was famously squeamish, and writing to his father, he wrote, "On seeing the dissecting room, which is abominable and horrid beyond conception, I found it very easy to persuade myself that I could do without being anything more than a spectator there." Smith's true love remains botany, and on the 28th of September, just 3 days after moving to London, Smith introduced himself at 32 Soho Square, the home of Sir Joseph Banks and the epicentre of British botany. Banks was the most famous botanist of his day, having accompanied Captain James Cook on his 1768 to 71 voyage of HMS Endeavour, but the ship returning laden with strange new plants from Australia. Banks became president of the Royal Society and a scientific advisor to government, recommending Botany Bay as an ideal location for a convict colony. On his first visit, Smith had to submit to the weigh-in. Banks had a set of scales just inside the door at Soho Square, where all visitors had their weights entered into a special book, which still survives in the Natural History Museum library. And from this, we know that Smith weighed just 9 stone, 3 pounds and 8 ounces. So he was always often in poor health and had delicate lungs throughout his life. It was at a breakfast party on the 23rd of December in the same year that Banks received a letter from Sweden offering him the entirety of Linnaeus' collections for the price of 1,000 guineas. After Linnaeus' death in 1778, the collections had passed to his son, Carl Linnaeus the Younger, but he had died suddenly in Paris in early November, and the Linnaeus family was now keen to realize the financial value. Banks read the letter aloud at breakfast and announced his intention to decline the offer before passing it to Smith and suggesting that he buy it instead, as a thing suitable to his taste that would do him honor. Smith immediately wrote 2 letters, one to Sweden asking for a catalogue, and another to his father asking for the money. And he engaged in long negotiations with both. 1,000 guineas at that time was a very liberal price for such a collection, but it was an awful lot for a merchant with 7 children to clothe. But Smith gradually wore his father down by emphasizing the individual value of parts of the collection, as well as pressuring him by saying that people were beginning to become interested, other purchasers were becoming interested. But thanks to Smith's connections, he managed to secure a deal before most of Europe was even aware, outwitting both the Professor of Botany at Oxford, John Sibthorpe, and Catherine the Great of Russia. So the collections finally arrived in London on the 10th of October, 1784. And as you can see from the statistics here, they were vast in number. Smith was chiefly interested in the 19,000 plant specimens, but he engaged with the majority of the collections in the succeeding decades. And shortly after they arrived, a story began circulating that the ship bringing them to Stockholm bringing them from Stockholm to London. On leaving the harbour, the King of Sweden dispatched the warship to bring them back. But the merchant ship had too much of a head start. There's no evidence for this story, unfortunately, nor the story that Smith had a special medal struck depicting the scene, but it nonetheless has entered Linnaean mythology and is a good indication of just how valuable these collections were. So at the age of 24, literally overnight, Smith had become a patron of learning, controlling access to these important collections, and he soon began receiving messages of congratulations, including from one friend who wrote, "The noble purchase of the Linnean cabinet most decidedly sets Britain above all other nations in the botanical empire." But to take his place in scientific society, Smith first needed to become a gentleman. So he began in May 1785 by becoming a fellow of the Royal Society, and he then abandoned his plans to return to Edinburgh to complete his medical studies. Instead, in 1786, traveling to Leiden in Holland to gain an MD there, where one could be had at any time of year. He kept a journal of his travels, and this here has actually only very recently come to light. It was previously unknown to us, but the Linnean Society managed to purchase it a couple of years ago. So Smith followed his MD with a trip to Paris to spend a month studying the herbariums there, but it quickly extended into a traditional grand tour with his friend from Edinburgh, William Young. That there was a lot more botany involved, and he met with many influential natural historians of today, using the Linnean collections as his calling card, including Jusso, Lamarck, and Spallanzani. Whilst he was in Paris, he made an excursion to Versailles just 3 years before the outbreak of the French Revolution, and observed with the rest of the public the royal family performing their public rituals. Smith noted in a letter back home that Louis XVI had, I quote, "grown fat and has an agreeable countenance. His ears are remarkably large and ugly. He had some very fine diamonds in his hat." He also met the widow of one of his heroes, the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Smith was horrified by the French fashions that he encountered in Paris. Again, I quote, "The daubing of the ladies' cheeks is beyond conception. Nature is quite out of the question. Old hags, ugly beyond what you can conceive, are dressed like girls in the most tawdry colours and have on each cheek a broad dab of the highest pink crayon." Smith's handwritten journal and subsequent published version are full of fascinating details, such as the dog in Monaco nicknamed Quattro Occhi, or four eyes, by the locals on account of the two spots about its eyes. Or on visiting the hospital in Genoa, Smith's shock at finding that each year about 700 women and 1,200 men were admitted for stab wounds from knives and stilettos. In Rome for Carnival, Smith was intrigued to meet a character dashing about, dressed as a Quaker, who, with an idiotic stare, would run up to people making a thrilling buzzing noise with his lips. And it was with some dismay that after witnessing him with another buzzing Quaker, shaking one another violently by the hand, that Smith and Young concluded that they were caricatures of Englishmen. And in Naples, Smith met the notorious Emma Hart, later Hamilton, mistress of Lord Nelson, whom he describes as a fine buxom damsel, and the German writer Goethe, who he describes as a polite, unassuming man, though identifying him as both author of the Sorrows of Young Werther and Prime Minister to the Duke of Saxe-Weimar, exactly the two things that Goethe had undertaken his own tour to escape from. Smith and Young arrived in Venice for Ascension Day and witnessed the penultimate Doge of Venice espousing the sea according to ancient custom. And this small sketch of the Doge appears in Smith's journal. So Smith returned to London at the end of 1787 with every intention of finally setting up as a physician and occasional lecturer in natural history, for which ends he moved to a new house at 12 Great Marble Street in the middle of the West End. But he was soon distracted again. Specifically on the 18th of March 1788, when with Samuel Goodenough and Thomas Marsham, he founded the Linnean Society of London. Its purpose was the cultivation of the science of natural history in all its branches, and more especially of the natural history of Great Britain and Ireland, with its most important functions to act as a facilitator of scientific communication, consultation and research, and for scientific papers to be read at meetings and published, something severely lacking in the natural history scene at the time. It was named after Linnaeus, whose publications were to form the Society's new bedrock, and Smith pledged Linnaeus' collections to the cause in his introductory discourse to the Society, stating that he was a trustee to the public, holding the treasures only for the purpose of making them useful to the world and natural history in general, and particularly to the Society, as a never-failing resource to us in every difficulty, as well as a fund of information not easily to be exhausted. At the first meeting, there were 20 fellows, 36 foreign members, utilising many of the contacts he'd picked up on this tour of the continent, 11 associates, and 3 honorary fellows enrolled. And Smith was elected the first president and would continue to be re-elected annually until his death. In 1789, he also began lecturing from his new home, which was also the Linnean Society's home, to both ladies and gentlemen. And he begins amassing several influential patrons and pupils, invariably aristocratic women, including the Dowager Marchioness of Rockingham, Lady Amelia Hume, Jane Barrington, the wife of the Bishop of Salisbury, and the Lady Cremorne, who was a close friend of Queen Charlotte. Smith was an extraordinarily adept social climber, and yet he always inspired intense friendship in others, maintaining many friendships for decades. And in September of that same year, he received the ultimate botanical accolade of having a plant named after him, Smithia sensitiva, an annual with small yellow flowers indigenous to Eastern Asia and Australia. The name sensitiva being a punning tribute to Smith's one and only paper for the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society on the irritability of plants, and also perhaps to his bashful nature. Smith was now possessor of the Linnean collections, fellow of the Royal Society, doctor of medicine, and president of a flourishing new scientific society, and he was still not yet 30. 12 Great Marble Street had become something of a new hub of scientific activity, rivaling even Banks's house in Soho Square, and this led to occasionally fraught relations between the two over the succeeding decades. Despite all of this, Smith struggled to find a successful publication at this time. In 1789, with the remarkably talented James Sowerby, he began publication of a selection of previously unfigured plants from Linnaeus' herbarium called Plantarum Icons Hactenus Ineditae, to be issued as a part work. Smith provided the scientific descriptions, whilst an uncredited Sowerby provided the uncoloured figures. But despite receiving critical praise, it struggled to find an audience and folded after just 3 issues. In 1790, Smith and Sowerby attempted a grander project, again previously unfigured plants, but this time only the most beautiful exotics, richly coloured, with much of the source material coming from Smith's aristocratic patrons. It was published in both English and Latin and included this Portlandia grandiflora, which was so large that it needed a special fold-out. It was well received by critics, but again, it struggled to find an audience, and this work in particular exhibits the tension between the aesthetic and scientific that was present in botanical publishing at that time, illustrated by this figure of Ligusticum cornubiensis, which appeared in the 2nd issue. This is an extremely rare, though thoroughly plain, British plant, and it had not been seen for almost a century, but had recently been rediscovered in Cornwall. Smith's correspondent, Thomas Woodward, recorded for Smith the frank conversation that ensued with his wife on observing the plate. Mrs. Woodward, what vile thing is that? Mr. Woodward, it is one of the scarcest English plants, and the figure is particularly curious. Mrs. Woodward, it may be, but for my part, they are all alike, and I can pick up 100 in the garden that can't be told from it. This was the most beautiful of all of Sowerby's productions, but again, it folded after just 3 issues. But finally, in 1790, the pair hit on a winning formula: English botany, or coloured figures of British plants. It was produced monthly at a cost of 1 shilling for 3 plates, and its intention was to provide a pictorial representation of the British flora. It was also written in English. It continued for 23 years, and by the time it ended in 1814, 36 volumes containing 2,592 individually coloured plates have been produced. It was hugely successful, and with Smith being paid a guinea per description, finally helped him give up the pretense of going into medicine. So with all of this high-profile botanizing, Smith soon came to the attention of Queen Charlotte, who was a keen amateur botanist. And in October 1792, he was invited to teach the Queen and princesses in botany and zoology at Frogmore, just outside Windsor. Linnaeus had enabled botany to become accessible to women, but as the name of the sexual system of classification suggests, it was fraught with dangers. Linnaeus had a vivid imagination, and to ease the understanding of his system, he had anthropomorphized plant sexuality, characterizing the stamens and pistils as husbands and wives. Thus, plants in the Monandria class were described as having one husband in a marriage, Diandria as 2 husbands in the same marriage, and Polyandria as having 20 males or more in the same bed with the female. There are many that feared the corrupting influence of such licentious language on the morals of women and girls, particularly the Cornish clergyman Richard Polwell, who wrote, "If botanizing girls do not take heed, they will soon exchange the blush of modesty for the bronze of impudence." Smith was well aware of the dangers and wrote to a friend of these lessons that he could not be very full on the various structures of the vesicule seminars, nor on the vulva hyans of the viola. This latter reference was from a particularly extravagant description by Linnaeus of the pollination of Viola tricolor. I quote, "With the flower having just opened, you will see the maidenly womb, its shape a concave bowl and open on the side, white and beautiful, gaping lustfully." The last 2 words being the vulva hyans. Smith clearly succeeded in sparing the royal blushes, though, as he was invited back the following year for another course of lectures. However, this time in the royal sun was not to last for long. In 1793, Smith published a sketch of a tour on the continent, an account of his grand tour. Since returning to England, the French Revolution had broken out, and Smith, who was a Whig, had some sympathy with the original intentions of this revolution and included some reflections on what had occurred. In a defense of the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose writings some had blamed for fueling the revolution, Smith compared Marie Antoinette to the infamously promiscuous Roman Empress Messalina. This was spectacularly bad timing, as the French Queen had just been guillotined 3 months prior. And the Queen was outraged. Through an intermediary, Smith was informed that on attempting to read the first volume of his work, the Queen had found so many bad things which she could never forgive that she could not go on. And Smith's standing invitation to Windsor was withdrawn. His friend Samuel Goodenough was not surprised, commenting that kings and queens naturally like to have the cause of kings and queens bepraised. But Smith was bitterly disappointed by the Queen's reactionary response, believing that she mistakes her own solid interest in these critical times, which is to make friends of all moderate people. On the 1st of March, 1796, 36-year-old James Edward Smith married Pleasance Reeve of Lowestoft, aged 22, who he described as a very fine person with an angelic countenance and a very pretty fortune. They had no children. In November 1796, Smith and Pleasance moved from London to 29 Surrey Street in Norwich, a house owned by Pleasance's father, which was described by Smith as possessing great elbow room. The main reason for the move was Smith's health, which was never good in the London air, as well as to concentrate on his publications. He intended to return to London a few times a year to see to his Linnaean duties, which he supplemented by sending a steady stream of scientific papers to be read at meetings. Despite fears that this would be the end of the Linnean Society, it continued to flourish, publishing regular transactions and in 1802 gaining a royal charter. But most of Smith's attention at this time was directed at his publications, particularly Flora Botanica, a 3-volume work published from 1800 to 1804, a much-needed updating of the British flora, the first since 1762. And he also became a regular botanical lecturer at the Royal Institution, and over the course of his later life would go on to give lectures in Liverpool, Birmingham, and Bristol. Despite this apparent happiness, there was trouble brewing for Smith. Richard Salisbury was a friend of Smith's from Edinburgh days, but in the late 1790s, he had switched allegiance from Linnaeus' sexual system to the natural system of Guizot. Salisbury quickly alienated his colleagues at the Linnean Society, particularly after commencing a project in 1797 to rename the Ericas, or heaths, which saw him change the name Erica tetralix, or cross-leaved Erica, to Erica botuliformis, or sausage-shaped heath. This enraged the old guard, but Smith stood by his friends for longer than most. But an increasingly cantankerous Salisbury soon turned his attentions onto Smith, attacking him in his publication Paradisus Londinensis, belittlingly referring to him as the celebrated lecturer Dr. Smith and undermining the Linnean system. In a description of Smithia sensitiva, Salisbury stated, "Not that I ever thought the plant at all adequate to commemorate his botanical merits, for it is a low, mean-looking hispid annual, though such is still my opinion of some of his labours." The public attacks were accompanied by equally bitter private letters and personal attacks, including an attempt to take Smith's 16-year-old botanical pupil to a prostitute, justifying the attempt by saying it would be good and manly for him. It got to the point where Salisbury published a pamphlet called The Generic Characters in the English Botany, in which he accused Smith of plagiarizing his descriptions from Linnaeus, and he had the audacity to present this pamphlet at a meeting of the Linnean Society. Friends urged Smith not to respond, with Robert Brown saying that Salisbury stands between a rogue and a fool, and the Scottish botanist James Brodie sagely warning, "The more you tread on a turd, the more it stings." After the dispute was noted in the monthly magazine, he could no longer restrain himself. Smith could no longer restrain himself, and he wrote a letter to the editor, which appeared on the front page, defending himself against all attacks. The botanical community rallied around Smith, and Salisbury was ostracized. He died in 1829, unnoticed, and despite in some respects being the better botanist, his work was ignored for decades. Despite all of this, Smith continued to rise to the pinnacle of British botany. In 1807, he published an introduction to botany, which was the most successful of all of his works, going through 5 editions in his lifetime and another 2 posthumously. The annual review praised Smith for having clearly yet wholesomely explained Linnaeus' system. So, I quote, the modest and timid may freely enter into the temple of Flora without fear of being insulted with the unhallowed mysteries of a licentious Venus. Smith was chosen as the editor of, John Sibthorpe's monumental Flora Graeca. John Sibthorpe, who died before he could commence work on this himself, left his materials in such a mess that Smith should more properly be credited as the author. Beyond lavish, this took over 40 years to complete and outsaw the original author, the first engraver of Smith's long-term collaborator Sowerby, and Smith himself, with Smith completing 7.5 volumes of the work, of the 10 volumes of the work. But he left his notes in a much better state than Sibthorpe for those completing the remainder of the production. Smith also wrote 3,348 articles for Abraham Rees's Cyclopedia, and in 1814, for his services to science, he was knighted by the Prince Regent. The 1820s were dedicated to the English flora, a new flora of Britain, written in English, and it's credited as having opened a new era in British botany, thanks to the exacting accuracy with which Smith had compiled his descriptions after a lifetime of study. Smith always prided himself on verifying everything with his own eyes and correcting every synonym that he came across. And the English flora remains an essential guide to the pre-Linnaean literature on each species. After increasing ill health, Smith died on the 17th of March, 1828, aged 68. Immediately afterwards, a fellow of the Linnean Society commented, "The lovers of science will join in lamenting it throughout the civilized world, and our society must feel it to be irreparable. They have lost their corporate parent as well as one of their greatest ornaments." So after Smith's death, his wife assumed the mantle of his editor. Pleasance lived until the age of 103, outliving her husband by some 49 years. She gave the majority of Smith's correspondence to the Linnean Society in 2 donations, but not before she'd gone through the entire lot with a pair of scissors and a bonfire. You can see here, this happens quite frequently in the letters. There'll be snippets just cut out, leaving tantalizing hints about what they might have contained. Pleasance seemed to have an earnest belief that future generations would only be interested in Smith's scientific correspondence. So she destroyed almost the entirety of the family correspondence, as well as most of the letters received from Smith's early friends. This is, for a biographer, very frustrating, as it's known that there was considerable sorrow in Smith's family. One of his sisters died aged 7. His brother Richard died in his early 20s in mysterious circumstances. Another brother, Francis, died, leaving a young family, and yet another brother, John Frederick, was declared a bankrupt, whilst his sister, Sarah Maria, ended her days committed to an insane asylum. But all of this is missing, with just the briefest of hints in letters contained in other repositories. And Pleasance has even done herself a disservice through this, as she, too, is a shadowy figure when she was clearly one of Smith's chief supports in life. Another unintended consequence of this is the correspondence that does survive is either scientific or from important people like the Marchioness of Rockingham, which leaves an impression that Smith was a social climber without any other considerations. So much of Smith's inner life is unknown, but he clearly inspired respect and admiration as both a botanist and a friend. After his death, Edward Smith Stanley, who succeeded him as president of the Linnean Society, said of Smith's loss, "In the friendly and social circles in which he so much delighted, it must be long and deservedly felt, nor will the place be filled in the estimation of the public and literary world with so much advantage to their objects, and such high credit to himself be soon or easily supplied." So Smith's legacy is all around us in this room today. There's a bust of him over there, and the society that he founded is now the world's oldest biological society. After Smith's death, the Linnaean collections and his own scientific collections came to the society for a price and still reside here, where they have been truly made accessible to all through digitization and publication of the specimen collections, the correspondence, and annotated library of Linnaeus, and soon the manuscripts of Linnaeus. And it was at a meeting of the Linnean Society on the 1st of July, 1858, that Darwin and Wallace first presented to the public their theories on evolution by natural selection. So I'd just like to end this talk with a quote from one of Smith's closest friends, Dawson Turner, who 2 years after Smith's death wrote of Smith's contribution to science. "By his works he has erected to himself an imperishable monument, and upon every occasion in these works he has uniformly studied to promote the happiness of mankind and the glory of God. As possessor of the Linnean Herbarium, his conduct was at all times eminently liberal, opening its treasures without reserve to men of every rank and station and of every clime. and as founder of the president of the Linnean Society, his amiable and condescending affability won him the regard of every member of that body, whilst that establishment gave a character and a permanency and an importance to the study of natural history in England, which it otherwise would not have attained. Thank you.